I clutched the armrest as the plane lurched through turbulence, my knuckles white against the worn fabric. 23 years I'd avoided flying, taking trains and buses across the country like some kind of transportation purist. But when your sister's wedding is in Hawaii and she specifically requests your presence, well, even the most dedicated aviophobe finds herself 35,000 feet above the Pacific, questioning every life choice that led to this moment. The businessman next to me glanced over with barely concealed irritation as I gripped his sleeve during a particularly violent shake. "Sorry," I muttered, releasing my death grip on his expensive suit jacket. "First time flying?" he asked, and something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. Mid-50s, silver hair perfectly styled despite the cabin pressure, and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. "Not exactly first time," I replied. "More like first time in over 2 decades. He raised an eyebrow. "That's quite a gap. What changed?" I was about to give him some generic response about family obligations when another bout of turbulence hit, and this time I noticed something odd. While I was practically hyperventilating, he remained perfectly calm, his hands steady on his laptop keyboard. But it wasn't just calm. It was the kind of stillness that comes from extensive experience, like he'd weathered far worse storms than a little atmospheric disturbance. "You fly a lot?" I asked, trying to distract myself from the plane's continued bouncing. "You could say that," he replied, closing his laptop with a decisive click. "I'm actually a pilot myself. Well, was. Retired now." Something about the way he said, "retired," sent a small chill down my spine. But before I could analyze that feeling, he was already moving into what I'd later recognize as his carefully rehearsed comfort routine. "Let me tell you something about turbulence," he continued, his voice taking on a professorial tone. "It's like driving over a gravel road. Uncomfortable, sure, but the plane is designed to handle much worse. These aircraft undergo stress tests that would make your head spin." His explanation was thorough, technical, and oddly soothing. By the time he finished describing wing flex capabilities and weather radar systems, my breathing had returned to something approaching normal. "You really know your stuff," I said, genuinely grateful for the distraction. "James Morrison," he said, extending his hand, "flew commercial for 32 years before I hung up my wings." "Elena Rodriguez," I replied, shaking his surprisingly soft hand. "And thank you. That actually helped." What I didn't mention was the nagging feeling that something about his demeanor didn't quite align with his story. Commercial pilots, in my limited experience, tended to have a particular way of carrying themselves. Confident but approachable, authoritative but reassuring. James had the confidence and authority in spades, but there was an edge to it, something that felt more military than civilian. As we continued talking, other small details began to accumulate in the back of my mind. The way he automatically scanned the cabin when he thought no one was looking. How he seemed to know exactly which flight attendant would be coming down the aisle before they appeared. The fact that despite claiming to be retired, he carried himself with the alertness of someone still very much on duty. "So what brings you to Hawaii?" I asked, figuring it was my turn to make conversation. "Business," he said, a little too quickly. "Consulting work, nothing too exciting." But when I glanced at his laptop screen before he'd closed it, I'd caught a glimpse of what looked like satellite imagery and a lot of numbers that didn't resemble any consulting report I'd ever seen. The flight continued, and James proved to be an engaging companion, sharing stories about his flying career that were entertaining and educational. He talked about landing in storms, dealing with mechanical failures, and the satisfaction of bringing hundreds of passengers safely to their destinations year after year. It was only when we began our descent into Honolulu that I noticed the first real crack in his carefully constructed persona. As the pilot announced our approach, James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he gripped his armrest with the same intensity I'd shown during takeoff. For someone who'd supposedly flown commercially for over 3 decades, he seemed remarkably tense about a routine landing. I watched as he tracked our descent, his eyes focused on the window with an intensity that went beyond casual interest. When we touched down with barely a bump, He exhaled in a way that suggested relief rather than professional appreciation for a job well done. Smooth landing, I commented, testing my theory. Yes, he agreed, but there was something in his voice, a note of surprise that a truly experienced commercial pilot wouldn't have felt about a textbook approach to one of the most familiar airports in the Pacific. As we taxied to the gate, I found myself studying James more carefully. The expensive clothes, the perfect grooming, the way he seemed to command attention without trying, it all spoke to someone accustomed to authority and respect. But there were other details, too. A small scar along his jawline that looked like it might have come from shrapnel, the way he instinctively positioned himself to keep the aisle in his peripheral vision, and most tellingly, the moment when another passenger's child dropped a metal toy and James's hand moved toward his waistband with the kind of reflexive speed that spoke to extensive tactical training. When we finally disembarked, I expected our brief friendship to end with the usual pleasantries and promises to stay in touch that neither party intended to keep. Instead, James surprised me by asking if I had plans for dinner. I know a place, he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Great view, excellent food, and I'd enjoy the company of someone who appreciates good conversation. There was something compelling about his invitation, beyond just the loneliness of traveling solo to a family event where I'd be the only single person at a table full of couples. Maybe it was curiosity about the contradictions I'd observed, or maybe it was the simple human desire to extend a pleasant connection just a little longer. I'd like that, I said, surprising myself. But I should mention, I have a pretty good radar for people who aren't exactly who they claim to be. James paused in the middle of collecting his carry-on bag, and for just a moment, his carefully maintained facade slipped enough for me to see something much sharper underneath. Then the mask was back in place, and he was smiling that practiced smile again. I think you'll find I'm exactly who I need to be, he said. And something about the phrasing made me realize I'd just accepted a dinner invitation from a man whose story had more holes than Swiss cheese. But instead of feeling threatened, I found myself intrigued. After 23 years of avoiding air travel, I'd expected my biggest discovery to be that flying wasn't as terrifying as I'd imagined. Instead, I'd stumbled into what felt like the opening chapter of something much more complex and potentially dangerous. As we walked through the terminal together, I caught James checking his phone with the kind of urgency that suggested he was expecting important news. When he glanced up and saw me watching, he offered another of those perfect smiles. Work calls, even in paradise, he said lightly. But I'd seen the message notification on his screen long enough to catch two words that made my pulse quicken. Target acquired. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to make polite excuses and disappear into the crowd of tourists and flower lace. But the part of me that had spent 2 decades avoiding challenges was curious enough about this particular mystery to override my better judgment. After all, what was the worst that could happen? Famous last words, as I'd soon discover. As we made our way toward the baggage claim, I noticed James steering us toward a less crowded area of the terminal. His hand was light on my elbow, guiding rather than directing, but there was an underlying firmness that suggested he was accustomed to having his subtle suggestions followed without question. The restaurant I mentioned, he said conversationally as we walked, it's a bit off the beaten path. Not the kind of place tourists usually find on their own. Sounds perfect, I replied, though internally I was cataloging exit routes and wondering if my sister would think to call airport security if I didn't show up for the wedding rehearsal tomorrow. I've always preferred places with character over places with crowds. James nodded approvingly. I had a feeling you were someone who appreciated authenticity. The irony wasn't lost on me, coming from a man whose entire persona was feeling increasingly manufactured with each passing minute. But I'd committed to this adventure, and my curiosity was stronger than my caution. Besides, I reasoned, we were in Hawaii, surrounded by people, and I'd survived worse than dinner with a mysterious stranger. Though as I thought about it, I realized I wasn't sure I actually had survived worse than dinner with a mysterious stranger. My life had been remarkably low stakes for the past 2 decades, which was exactly how I'd preferred it after the events that had driven me to avoid flying in the first place. But that's a story for later, because right now I was following a man who claimed to be a retired commercial pilot, but carried himself like someone still very much in the intelligence game, toward a restaurant that was apparently so exclusive that tourists couldn't find it on their own. The restaurant turned out to be a small establishment tucked away in a residential area of Honolulu, the kind of place that looked like someone's converted home, and probably was. No neon signs, no tourist menus in multiple languages, just a simple wooden sign that read, Kai's Kitchen, and a parking lot filled with cars that had seen better decades. James had driven us there in a rental SUV that was far too high-end for someone on a consulting budget, though he'd waved off my questions about the expense with some vague comment about client reimbursements. Inside, the restaurant was even more intimate than it had appeared from the outside. Maybe a dozen tables total, dim lighting, and the kind of atmosphere that suggested most patrons were either locals or people who'd been specifically directed there by someone in the know. The host greeted James by name, which could have been impressive customer service or evidence that he was a regular despite claiming this was a business trip. "Mr. Morrison," the host said with genuine warmth. "Your usual table?" "Please," James replied, and I noticed he didn't introduce me or explain my presence. We were seated at a corner table that offered excellent views of both the entrance and the kitchen, positioning that seemed strategic rather than coincidental. As we settled in, I decided to test the waters a bit more directly. "So tell me about this consulting work," I said, accepting a menu from our server. "What kind of companies need the expertise of a retired commercial pilot?" James took his time answering, ostensibly studying the menu, though I suspected he already knew it by heart. "Aviation safety, mostly," he said finally. "Airlines wanting to improve their training protocols, smaller carriers looking to upgrade their procedures, that sort of thing." It was a perfectly reasonable answer that explained exactly nothing. Aviation safety consultants existed, certainly, but they tended to work with a lot of documentation and rarely required the kind of satellite imagery I'd glimpsed on his laptop. "Must be interesting work," I pressed. "Do you miss the actual flying?" "Every day," he said, and for the first time since we'd met, his response felt completely genuine. "There's nothing quite like being responsible for an aircraft full of people, knowing that every decision you make could be the difference between a routine flight and a tragedy." The server appeared before I could follow up, and James ordered wine with the confidence of someone familiar with the restaurant's selection. As we waited for our food, the conversation shifted to safer topics. My work as a freelance graphic designer, his observations about how aviation had changed over his career, the beauty of Hawaiian sunsets. But underneath the pleasant dinner conversation, I was increasingly aware that James was conducting his own subtle interrogation. He asked about my family, my travel history, my reasons for avoiding flying, and my plans for the rest of my Hawaii trip. His questions were smoothly integrated into natural conversation, but they were definitely questions and they were definitely designed to gather information. When I mentioned that my sister was marrying a military contractor, I caught a brief flicker of interest in his eyes that he quickly suppressed. "Defense work?" he asked casually. "Something like that," I replied, borrowing his own evasive style. "I don't really understand what he does. Something with logistics and overseas operations?" This time, James couldn't quite hide his reaction. His hand paused halfway to his wine glass, and I saw him process this information with the kind of focused attention that confirmed my growing suspicion that this wasn't a chance encounter at all. "Small world," he murmured, taking a sip of his wine. "I've done some work with defense contractors myself over the years. The aviation industry overlaps with military operations more than most people realize." Our food arrived before I could pursue this revelation, but I was no longer particularly interested in eating. Instead, I was trying to piece together a puzzle that was becoming more complex and potentially dangerous with each new piece of information. My sister's fiancé worked for a company that provided logistic support for overseas military operations. I was in Hawaii for their wedding. James claimed to be a retired pilot, but showed signs of extensive tactical training and was clearly comfortable in what felt like a surveillance situation. And despite his story about this being a business trip, he'd been expecting me, or at least someone like me, to be on that particular flight. "James," I said carefully, setting down my fork, "I need to ask you something, and I'd appreciate a straight answer." He looked up from his plate with the kind of alert attention that told me he'd been expecting this moment. "Of course." Did you know who I was before we met on the plane? For several long seconds, he didn't respond. I watched him weigh his options, calculate risks, and arrive at some internal decision. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the genial consultant tone and taken on something much more serious. Elena Rodriguez, freelance graphic designer, sister of Rebecca Rodriguez, who's marrying Thomas Chen tomorrow at the Maui Bay Resort. You've avoided flying for 23 years due to what the FAA records show as an incident involving Flight 447 from Denver to Phoenix in 2002. You live alone in Portland, Oregon, have no significant romantic relationships, and maintain minimal contact with extended family beyond your sister. The casual recitation of my personal details hit me like a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications sank in. This wasn't a chance meeting. This wasn't even a case of mistaken identity or coincidental seating assignment. Someone had specifically arranged for me to be seated next to James Morrison, if that was even his real name, and they'd done enough research on my background to know details I rarely shared with anyone. "Who are you?" I whispered, though I was no longer sure I wanted to know the answer. "More importantly," James said quietly, "do you know who Thomas Chen really is?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. My sister's fiancé was a nice guy from what I'd observed during their courtship. Successful, attentive to Rebecca, and apparently devoted to making her happy. But I realized that my knowledge of him was entirely filtered through Rebecca's glowing reports and the brief interactions I'd had during family video calls. I didn't actually know anything substantive about his work, his background, or his life before he'd met my sister. "I know he makes Rebecca happy," I said carefully. "I know he's successful enough to afford a destination wedding in Hawaii. And I know that you've done enough research on my family to know details that should be private." James nodded slowly. "Thomas Chen isn't just a defense contractor, Elena. He's a facilitator for weapons transfers to regions where such transfers violate international law. Your sister's wedding isn't just a celebration. It's cover for a meeting between Chen and several potential clients who will be attending as family friends." The restaurant suddenly felt too small, too warm, too exposed. I looked around at the other diners, wondering if any of them were part of whatever operation James represented, or if they were innocent locals enjoying their dinner while unaware that a conversation about international arms dealing was taking place at the corner table. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "And more importantly, why should I believe you?" James reached into his jacket and produced a slim tablet, which he activated and turned toward me. The screen showed a series of photographs. Thomas at what appeared to be a business meeting with men I didn't recognize, documents with official-looking letterheads, and shipping manifests for cargo that was described in terms too vague to be legitimate. "Because," James said quietly, "we need your help to stop him." The photographs continued to scroll past on the tablet screen. Images of weapons crates, bank transfer records, and most damning of all, what appeared to be surveillance photos of my sister and Thomas together at various locations over the past several months. The final image made my blood run cold. A photo of Rebecca laughing at something Thomas had said, taken with the kind of telephoto lens that suggested professional surveillance. She looked happy and completely unaware that her relationship was apparently the subject of a federal investigation. "We?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "CIA, NSA, one of those alphabet soup agencies that officially doesn't exist? Let's just say we're the people who handle situations that fall between the cracks of official channels," James replied, taking back the tablet and powering it down. "Thomas Chen has been on our radar for 2 years, but he's careful, well-connected, and smart enough to keep his legitimate business activities separate from his other interests. This wedding gives us an opportunity to gather evidence and identify his network of contacts." I felt like I was drowning in information that I didn't want, and implications that I couldn't ignore. 23 years I'd spent avoiding complications, building a quiet life that didn't involve international intrigue or moral dilemmas. And now I was sitting in a Hawaiian restaurant, being recruited by a mysterious government agent to spy on my sister's wedding. "What exactly do you expect me to do?" I asked. "I'm a graphic designer, not a secret agent. I create logos and website layouts, not international incidents." "You're also Rebecca's sister," James pointed out, "which means You'll be at the wedding, in the wedding party, with access to areas and conversations that our other assets won't be able to reach. We need someone on the inside who can observe, document, and potentially gather intelligence on Chen's associates. The casual mention of other assets sent another chill through me. This wasn't a hastily thrown together operation. This was a coordinated effort with multiple moving parts, and I was apparently being recruited as one of those parts. And if I say no? I asked. James's expression grew serious. Then we proceed without your help, but with significantly less chance of success. And Elena, if we can't gather enough evidence to stop Chen through legal channels, there are other people in this business who are less concerned with due process and collateral damage. The threat was oblique but unmistakable. If I didn't help them build a case against Thomas, someone else might take more direct action that could put Rebecca in danger. It was elegantly manipulative, appealing to both my sense of civic duty and my protective instincts toward my sister. I need time to think, I said. James nodded and signaled for the check. Of course, but Elena, the wedding is tomorrow and the opportunity will pass quickly. Whatever you decide, you need to decide tonight. As we left the restaurant, my mind was reeling with questions and implications. Was Rebecca aware of Thomas's alleged activities? Was she in danger? Was this entire scenario legitimate, or was I being manipulated into some other agenda altogether? The drive back to my hotel was conducted in relative silence, though I was acutely aware that James was watching me with the same careful attention he'd shown throughout the evening. When we pulled up to the hotel entrance, he handed me a business card with only a phone number printed on it. If you decide to help, he said, call that number before 10 a.m. tomorrow. If not, enjoy the wedding and forget we ever met. I looked at the card, then back at his face. How do I know you're telling me the truth? How do I know you're even one of the good guys? James was quiet for a long moment. You don't, he said finally, but you know your sister. And you know when something doesn't feel right. Trust your instincts, Elena. They got you through whatever happened 23 years ago, and they'll get you through this. The reference to my past, to the reason I'd stopped flying, was another reminder of how thoroughly they'd researched my background. But it was also, paradoxically, reassuring. If they knew about Flight 447, they knew I'd faced a crisis before and survived it. As I walked through the hotel lobby toward the elevators, I found myself replaying every interaction I'd had with Thomas during the past year. The expensive gifts he'd given Rebecca, the vague explanations of his work, the way he'd insisted on paying for everything related to the wedding, including flights and accommodations for family members. At the time, I'd attributed his generosity to success and genuine affection for my sister. Now I wondered if it had been something else entirely. The behavior of someone who needed to maintain appearances and ensure that potential witnesses were happy and distracted. In my hotel room, I sat on the bed and stared at James's business card. The smart thing to do was throw it away, attend the wedding, make polite conversation, and return to Portland with nothing more dramatic to report than my successful conquest of flight anxiety. But I couldn't stop thinking about the surveillance photo of Rebecca, the implications of what James had told me, and the growing certainty that my sister was about to marry someone who was not at all who she thought he was. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my recent conversations with Rebecca. Her messages over the past few months had been full of excitement about the wedding, gratitude for Thomas's thoughtfulness, and references to the amazing friends he'd introduced her to. At the time, I'd been happy that she'd found someone who brought interesting people into her life. Now I wondered if those amazing friends were the international arms dealers who would apparently be attending tomorrow's ceremony as wedding guests. The business card seemed to grow heavier in my hand as I contemplated the choice I was facing. On one side was the safe path, ignorance, plausible deniability, and the preservation of my carefully constructed, quiet life. On the other side was the possibility that my sister was in genuine danger, and that I was the only one positioned to help her. It wasn't really a choice at all. I didn't sleep much that night, alternating between staring at the ceiling and researching Thomas Chen on my laptop. What I found was frustratingly consistent with both his cover story and James's allegations. Chen Holdings appeared to be a legitimate logistics company with contracts throughout Southeast Asia and the Middle East. Their website was professional, Their client testimonials were glowing, and their reported revenues were substantial enough to explain Thomas's obvious wealth. But there were also gaps in the information. Periods where the company's activities were described in vague terms, regions where they claimed to operate but provided no specific details, and a notable absence of the kind of regulatory filings that most international logistics companies would be required to maintain. By 6 a.m., I'd made my decision. I called the number on James's card, half expecting it to ring through to some generic voicemail system. Instead, James answered on the second ring, sounding fully alert despite the early hour. "I'm in," I said without preamble, "but I want some ground rules." "I'm listening." "First, Rebecca's safety is non-negotiable. Whatever happens, whatever you discover, she doesn't get hurt. Second, if this goes wrong and my cover gets blown, you extract me immediately. And third, if you're lying to me about any of this, I will make it my life's mission to destroy you." James was quiet for a moment, then chuckled. "Fair enough. Can you meet me for breakfast? There are some things we need to discuss before the wedding." An hour later, I found myself in another off-the-beaten-path location, this time a coffee shop that looked like it catered exclusively to locals. James was already there, occupying the same kind of strategically positioned table he'd chosen at dinner. But this morning, he wasn't alone. The woman sitting across from him was probably in her 40s, with short dark hair and the kind of understated appearance that suggested she was very good at blending into crowds. She stood when I approached, extending her hand with a firm grip. "Elena, this is Agent Sarah Martinez," James said, and I noticed he didn't bother with any cover story about consulting work. "She'll be your handler for this operation." "Handler?" I repeated, suddenly feeling like I'd wandered into a spy novel. That sounds ominously professional for someone who's supposed to be an amateur volunteer. Sarah smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Don't worry, we're not expecting you to hack into computer systems or plant listening devices. Your role is much simpler. Observe, remember, and report. Think of yourself as our eyes and ears at the wedding." She opened a small portfolio and spread several photographs across the table. "These are the individuals we expect to attend the wedding as Chen's associates. Some will be using their real names, others will be traveling under aliases. We need you to identify as many as possible and note who Chen speaks with privately." The photographs showed men and women of various ages and ethnicities, all with the kind of expensive casual attire and confident bearing that suggested wealth and influence. Some faces were familiar from international news coverage, though I couldn't immediately place them. Others were complete unknowns, at least to me. "How am I supposed to identify people I've never met?" I asked. "And more importantly, how do I do it without looking like I'm conducting surveillance at my sister's wedding?" James produced a small device that looked like a high-end smartphone but was clearly something more specialized. "This will help," he said, handing it to me. "Point it at anyone you want to identify, and it will run facial recognition against our database. The results will appear as text messages, so it will look like you're just checking your phone frequently. And if someone asks why I'm taking so many photos, you're documenting your sister's special day," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. Completely normal behavior for a devoted sister. The plan they outlined was straightforward enough in concept. I would attend all the wedding events as a normal guest, but I would also be documenting the other attendees and watching for any interactions that seemed business-related rather than social. If I observed anything significant, I would send coded text messages to a number they provided. "What happens after I gather this information?" I asked. "That depends on what you find," James replied. "If we can identify enough of Chen's network and document their presence at what's essentially a business meeting disguised as a wedding, we'll have grounds for a larger investigation. If we get lucky and overhear specific plans or transactions, we might be able to take immediate action." "And Rebecca?" "We'll hopefully never know that any of this happened," Sarah said. "Our goal is to build a case against Chen that's based on his business activities, not his personal relationships. If we do this right, your sister will simply become a widow when Chen is arrested, rather than an accomplice." The casual way she discussed Rebecca becoming a widow was jarring, but I suppose that from their perspective, my sister had unknowingly entangled herself with someone whose activities put her at risk regardless of their intervention. At least this way she might emerge as a victim rather than a co-conspirator. "There's one more thing," James said, his expression growing serious. "Chen is smart, and he's paranoid. If he suspects that anyone at the wedding is there for reasons other than celebrating his marriage, he'll shut down any business discussions and possibly accelerate whatever timeline he's operating on. So your cover needs to be perfect." Meaning? Meaning you need to be the devoted sister, slightly overwhelmed by the exotic location, maybe a bit nervous about flying, but thrilled to be there for Rebecca's big day. Nothing in your behavior can suggest that you're anything other than exactly what you appear to be. I thought about this as I walked back to my hotel to prepare for the wedding. 23 years of avoiding complications had taught me to be observant about people and situations, skills that might actually be useful in this bizarre scenario. But it had also made me risk-averse and uncomfortable with deception, qualities that could be problematic if I needed to maintain a cover story under pressure. The wedding was scheduled for late afternoon at the Maui Bay Resort, with a reception to follow. Rebecca had chosen a beautiful oceanfront location that would provide stunning photos and a romantic atmosphere for what she believed was the happiest day of her life. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. My sister's dream wedding was serving as cover for an intelligence operation targeting the man she loved. I spent the morning trying on different outfits and practicing natural ways to use the surveillance device James had given me. By noon, I'd convinced myself that I looked like a normal wedding guest, rather than an undercover operative. Whether I could maintain that appearance under actual operational conditions remained to be seen. The taxi ride to the resort gave me time to review the faces from the photographs and prepare myself mentally for what I was about to do. I'd attended plenty of weddings over the years, but never one where I was simultaneously trying to identify international arms dealers while maintaining the facade of a happy family member. As we pulled into the resort's circular driveway, I saw that the venue was everything Rebecca had described and more. Manicured gardens, pristine beaches, and elegant architecture that perfectly captured the romantic tropical aesthetic she'd been dreaming of. Under different circumstances, I would have been focused entirely on enjoying the beauty of the location and celebrating my sister's happiness. Instead, I found myself automatically cataloging security cameras, exit routes, and sightlines. The surveillance training was apparently kicking in faster than I'd expected. Rebecca was waiting for me in the bridal suite, radiant in a dress that had probably cost more than my car. She threw her arms around me with genuine joy, and for a moment I forgot about everything except how happy she looked. "Elena, I can't believe you actually flew here. How was it?" "Were you terrified? You look amazing." Her rapid-fire questions and obvious excitement were infectious, and I found myself smiling genuinely for the first time since my dinner with James. "It wasn't as bad as I expected," I said, which was technically true, though it omitted the part about being recruited by mysterious government agents. "And you look absolutely stunning. Thomas is a lucky man." Rebecca beamed at the mention of her fiancé. "He's been so wonderful through all of this planning. Did you know he personally called everyone to make sure they had everything they needed for travel? And he insisted on upgrading everyone's accommodations because he wanted this to be perfect." The mention of Thomas personally contacting all the wedding guests sent a small chill through me. From Rebecca's perspective, it was evidence of his thoughtfulness. From my newly acquired operational perspective, it suggested careful management of who would be present and where they would be staying. "That was very thoughtful of him," I managed. "I'm looking forward to meeting more of his friends and family." "Oh, you'll love them," Rebecca said enthusiastically. "They're such interesting people from all over the world. Thomas has friends everywhere because of his business, and they've all come such long distances to be here. I feel so lucky to be marrying someone who inspires that kind of loyalty." As Rebecca continued talking about the guests and the ceremony, I realized that every detail she mentioned as evidence of Thomas's success and popularity could equally be interpreted as confirmation of James's allegations. The international guest list, the expensive accommodations, the careful coordination, it all fit either narrative depending on your perspective. A knock at the door interrupted my growing unease. "Come in," Rebecca called, and the door opened to reveal Thomas Chen himself, looking every inch the successful businessman in an impeccably tailored suit. He was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Rebecca, you look absolutely perfect," he said, moving to kiss her cheek while carefully avoiding disturbing her carefully arranged hair. "And Elena, I'm so glad you could make it. Rebecca has talked about you constantly." His handshake was firm, and his smile seemed genuine. But I found myself analyzing his body language with the same critical attention I'd applied to James the day before. Thomas carried himself with the kind of relaxed confidence that came from being in control of his environment, and when he looked at me, I felt like I was being evaluated rather than greeted. "Thank you for arranging everything so beautifully," I said. "Rebecca tells me you've taken care of all the details personally." "My pleasure," he replied. "When you love someone, you want everything to be perfect for them." It was exactly the right thing to say, and Rebecca practically glowed at his words. But there was something in Thomas's eyes as he spoke that suggested he was as aware as I was that we were both performing for an audience. "I should let you ladies finish getting ready," Thomas continued. "But Elena, I hope we'll have a chance to talk more at the reception. I'd love to hear about your work." After he left, Rebecca returned to her preparations with renewed energy, chattering about flowers and music and photography. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas's request to discuss my work hadn't been casual small talk. In the world of international arms dealing, a freelance graphic designer might be useful for creating false documentation, laundering money through creative services contracts, or maintaining cover identities. Or maybe I was being paranoid, and he was simply making conversation with his future sister-in-law. The problem with surveillance operations, I was discovering, was that once you started looking for suspicious behavior, everything became suspicious. As I helped Rebecca with final preparations, I tried to focus on being genuinely present for my sister while simultaneously preparing myself for the evening ahead. In a few hours, I would be walking into what might be a gathering of international criminals, armed with nothing but a disguised smartphone and instructions to observe and report. It was either the most important thing I'd ever done, or the most elaborate con game I'd ever fallen for. Either way, there was no backing out now.